Welcome back to another rendition of the Injury Report. I'm Dr. John, your host, and you're going to have to work with me today and next week. Our editing extraordinaire, Sasha, is currently away and enjoying some time off. So this is unedited raw footage. So you're about to see just how many mistakes I make every time I record. But without further ado, it is the most wonderful time of the year, not only for the holidays, but as a sports fan. We have Thanksgiving Day games coming up in the NFL. We have NBA Christmas Day games, and this year we even have Christmas Day games for the NFL. So what's better than food and football? I haven't found out yet, but if you think of something, you let me know in the comments. But it doesn't get much better than this. So without further ado, let's get into today's injury report. So touching on some important players from around the league. Mooney, the wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons, had been dealing with an Achilles issue and then a hamstrings issue. I think he even popped up with a back injury at one point. He's now back on the report with a hamstring injury, and I believe he actually left the game at some point because of it last week, or excuse me, 2 weeks ago. They had a bye this past week. He's been limited in practice. He may or may not play. It's still unclear. Two other wide receivers to keep an eye on are Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Lockett's dealing with a knee injury, and Metcalf is dealing with a shoulder injury. Both of them did not practice earlier this week and may or may not play. If they do play, though, expect them to tear up a Jets defense that has just been horrible recently. But that's a completely different conversation. Speaking of the Jets, Breece Hall has been on the injury report with a knee injury. They are taking him day by day, and it's unclear if he's actually going to play, which would be a huge blow to the Jets, even though they're absolutely horrible. He's been one of the few bright spots and is a fantastic running back. So especially from a fantasy perspective, he's usually good for 15 plus points a game just by pure volume. So make sure you pay attention to that if you have him on your team. Devontae Smith did miss last week with a hamstring injury. He did not practice this week so far, and that's something to keep an eye on because last week he did not practice throughout the week and he missed the game. So he's probably going to need some participation, at least limited, on Thursday to hopefully go into Friday and the weekend without an injury designation for this week's game. The Lions have a fantastic running back duo in Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. And personally, I love their nickname, Sonic and Knuckles. But unfortunately, Knuckles is on the injury report. Ironically enough, it's not his hand or his wrist, but it's actually his shoulder. If you happen to watch the game, it looks like he ran pretty hard into one of the defenders. I forget who it was they were playing last night. Oh, the Jaguars. Yeah, oh gosh, yeah, the Jaguars. Anyways, he ran pretty hard into one of the defenders with his shoulder, leading with his shoulder like he should to protect his head. He missed a couple of plays, missed the fourth quarter, but he's expected to play this week. That is my divination for this week is that David Montgomery will play today. But you'll see this a few days after. So we'll be able to find out if I'm right or wrong. Usually I'm wrong, but we'll find out. Lastly, before we get into our deep dive for the week, Gardner Minshew, the starting quarterback for the Raiders, is going to miss the rest of the season with a fractured collarbone that he suffered. That means that Aiden O'Connell will likely step in and take that role. But if you've been following the NFL or if you're a Raiders fan, unfortunately, your best course of action is probably just to stay away from them fantasy-wise, unless it's Jacoby Myers. He seems to be having a pretty good season, but he's getting all the volume right now. And of course, Brock Bowers is a very good receiving tight end as well. So it's something to keep an eye on fantasy-wise. Expect a dip in their production as they go through a quarterback change. Alrighty, this is going to hurt for a lot of Philly fans. And if you're unaware, I'm recording this. Mobility Doc is located in Bethlehem, PA. So Philly is very close to home here. And Brandon Graham left the game after reaching the third most sacks in Eagles history with a torn triceps. He will be out for the season. Unfortunately, this was expected to be his last season. I believe he may have said that himself. While that continues to be held true, remains to be seen. He seems like the type of guy that can make a comeback, but that is for Brandon Graham to decide himself and his family. What we're going to look at here is what happened, why it happened, and recovery-wise, what this means for him. So, triceps injury, what we're talking about, right, is this muscle on the back here, right? Why we call it the triceps is because it has three heads. So this triceps tear, for Graham specifically, he mentioned that he was dealing with some tendinitis prior to him fully rupturing it. In my previous video last year, I believe, talking about the Aaron Rodgers injury with the Achilles tear, still too soon, we talked about how the tendinitis leaves that tendon more vulnerable to these types of injuries. And you're talking about grown men moving at extremely quick speeds, both in the short burst, powerful movements, as well as just over time, they're sprinting at full speed. And you throw in contact like that, even if it's accidental, it leads to an injury like this. Some of the more common ways of rupturing triceps is examples such as like local injection of steroids, falling on an outstretched hand, or even direct trauma to that elbow. And as a whole, a triceps tear is really, really uncommon. It's actually like one of the most uncommon ruptures or injuries in the shoulder, or excuse me, in the upper extremity, I should say, even though it does cross the shoulder. And depending on the study or the research that you look at, it can be as low as 1% of injuries in the upper extremity. It's just really not that common. When this occurs, the athlete or patient or person may feel or hear a pop. They're unable to extend that elbow against gravity. And you may be able to feel like a gap between where the muscle is here and the olecranon of the elbow. This is where it's most likely for that tendon to rupture, is off this distal end right here. So where this tendon is running down and attaching onto the olecranon process of the elbow. Now, you might be thinking, oh, you know, it's a rupture. It's not great. It definitely isn't. But similar to an Achilles, they have to repair it. It takes time, but it can move forward. This repair can actually have a couple of different complications. Sometimes, just like with any other surgery, there is always the risk of a failure of the repair, in the sense that it either ruptures again during recovery or within a set time period, or, and this is the bigger complication to be mindful of, is that ulnar nerve can become injured, whether it's through the course of the initial injury or in recovery, that nerve then becomes irritated, and you begin to have other complications. Now, following the surgical repair, where they reattach the tendon to the olecranon process to allow the tricep to be intact again, they're going to place that elbow in a long splint. So it's going to be stuck somewhere between 30 to 45 degrees of elbow flexion, and it's just going to not allow that elbow to move at all. Typically for the first 2 to 3 weeks, maybe, depending on the surgeon and their rehab protocol. Each one can be a little bit different, especially when it comes to the range of motion that you're progressing through within the first couple of weeks. But that just allows the site to heal. You just need time for that tendon to heal back to the bone before you actually just start having any type of movement, whether it's passive, active, or active assisted. So after they get out of the long splint, then they're going to put them in a hinged elbow brace. And what this brace allows you to do is manually, slowly adjust how much range of motion that elbow is afforded. Typically, it'll block like elbow flexion, especially because you don't want to stress that tendon. And as you stretch it, it's going to place more stress on that site, on that graft. And then it will allow a little bit more extension because you'll give some of that slack to the muscle. However, active range of motion should be avoided both in flexion, but especially extension. Flexion, you have a little bit more wiggle room just because you're not actively using that tricep to flex the elbow, but again, you're putting stress on that site as you move into elbow flexion. So you want to avoid that as well, especially in the beginning. That just leads to an increased likelihood of rupture, which is something we want to avoid. Early on in rehab, as you get into the hinged elbow brace out of the long splint, you're going to focus on just passive range of motion, working both into flexion, and extension. As you move forward from there, you can move into then active assisted and then active range of motion, working towards full range of motion, which is typically looked to achieve around weeks 6 to 7, again, depending on the protocol. And then strengthening will typically begin around weeks 10 through 12. Initially, when you're in the brace, the hinged brace, early on in your recovery, you'll be able to do exercises like ball squeezes, some shoulder range of motion, things of that nature that aren't actively working the musculature surrounding the elbow, specifically that triceps. But strengthening for the elbow itself will begin around 10 to 12 weeks after. Most patients / athletes are able to return to their prior level of activity and level of sport that they previously were at before they got injured. But it depends on the severity of the tear and, of course, complications with that ulnar nerve. That ulnar nerve supplies several muscles through this forearm and your hand, and is really, really important for not only sensation, but then gripping as well. So a lot of times that is what ends up complicating this recovery, as that ulnar nerve actually dives really, really close to right where this triceps tendon is. So that's a little bit of a deep dive on Brandon Graham. I loved in the comments someone mentioned, that we could talk about their fantasy outputs. For Brandon Graham specifically, he's a defensive player. Some leagues allow you to draft defensive players, not many though. Something I've always been interested in, but never took the time to do. And for him, obviously he's a little bit older. He's one of the only remaining players on that Eagles Super Bowl team besides, I think it was Lane Johnson and Jake Elliott, but someone fact check me on that. I could be wrong. So if this is the end of his season and career, he had a phenomenal career. He is a player that absolutely embodied Philly and what that team was about. He was a huge piece of bringing that team around, that defense around this year. And it's really, really unfortunate not only to see anyone get hurt, but a player of his caliber and standing. So from a fantasy standpoint, he's not necessarily going to be scoring you points on any given week unless it's a fumble recovery or a sack. But in that sense, obviously that will be missed for the Eagles. They definitely need some pass rushers with some consistency there, and he was a big piece of that. But for these other players that I mentioned, Metcalf and Lockett, for example, they didn't seem too concerned. I would expect them to play. But obviously going up against, one of them will have to play against Sauce Gardner, the other one against DJ Reed. But it seems like anyone can shred that Jets defense. So if it was me, I'd start them. They look like they're going to have a good week. And Breece Hall with that knee, I think they're being protective with him, which I think is a good move. But I'd expect him to play. He's been that bright spot, like I said, for the Jets offense, and he's just going to get a ton of volume. So even if he's not at 100%, expect him to get some points. But I hope you guys enjoyed this week's injury report. As always, leave any comments, suggestions, or thoughts in the space down below. And make sure you click that bell, subscribe, so that you get updates for whenever these videos release. And thank you for bearing through this raw footage and all of this fun mistakes that I make. So happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Enjoy the games. Hopefully my divination with Montgomery was correct. If it is, I'll probably start a streak. We'll keep count of that. But enjoy your holidays, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks, guys.